The bell dies like a betrayal. 8 seconds, a single breath. And an empire takes more than land. It takes a sound, a name, a life that was remembered. Imagine a stone chapel on a hill, herbs hanging from the rafters, clay chalices still warm from the breath of prayer. Women who measure time by prayer and not by war. The air tastes of iron and distant smoke. The horizon that promised seasons now promises banners. They do not arrive like a slaughtering mob, but like a machine of order. They catalog the living as assets, reassign souls with ink and seal. The first 8 seconds are a contract written in fear. You hear the bell break and immediately the turning of pages in a ledger. That turning of pages is the most subtle violence. I do not speak to you as a storyteller, but as an instructor. This is not entertainment. It is reconnaissance, a descent into the way power systems perfect the efficiency of forgetting. The women you are about to hear are not faceless victims. They are the front line of cultural memory, guardians of the chant, archivists of vows. Tear them out and you empty a people from within. The empire learned this. You do not always have to kill to conquer. Procedures are designed. On the surface, terms and promises. Underground, the re-education of memory. Sanctuary in exchange for names. Protection in exchange for forgetting. To convert is to survive. To refuse is to be reoriented, reappropriated, repurposed. The bureaucratic word to name the stripping of the interior. Imagine being stripped of the right to insist on the inside while your body executes rituals the state demands. Imagine your voice used as proof that resistance can be domesticated, that faith can learn obedience. That is the point. To produce living portraits of submission so clean they seem like doctrine. To display bodies like showcases, not to recount a victory, but to teach that disobedience is sanitized, that memory is quarantined. If you understand this, you will understand why the story that follows is not a sequence of blows, but of signatures. Not of bonfires, but of forms. Not of screams, but of administered silences. The architecture of forgetting is built with 3 materials: time, procedure, and translation. Time to wear down the will, procedure to regulate the breathing of daily life, translation to rename that which should have remained sacred. The bell is silenced, not forever, but long enough for the ear to forget its tone. Words are changed, not convent, but domestic unit, not vow, but social function, not contemplative silence, but performance. And when words change, things change with them. The sisters do not know it yet, but they have already been moved from one box to another, from subjects of faith to columns in an inventory. The hill where the chapel stands smells of smoke long before the men arrive. Eleni senses it first, an old instinct, polished by nights of keeping watch over candles, too close to parchment. She touches her crucifix, cold metal, hot pulse, and sees the sky turn purple with a fire that is not dawn. Behind her, the others kneel, whispered psalms trembling like reeds. The sound arrives later, calculated footsteps, boots on the stone path that had only known bare feet. The door trembles, it does not explode. The machine of order needs no uproar, the tap of the seal is enough. The first man to cross the threshold wears no armor. He carries a scroll. His flat eyes scan the faces like a merchant feeling grain. The parchment rustles. Imperial decree. Convert and serve, or oppose and disappear. The translator, yes, there is always a tongue that mediates the blow, breaks mid-sentence. The silence that follows weighs more than the words. Eleni rises. We have already been claimed, she says with a clarity that stitches up the fear of the others. There is nothing left for you to take. The officer's smile is minimal, almost compassionate, but there is no compassion in it. The scroll is closed. No knives are drawn, only bolts are thrown. Water is restricted. Bread is rationed. Victory does not run. It sits and waits for faith to decay in slow motion. The voices pray in shifts, tired echoes against the stone, until prayer begins to seem like madness. Outside, laughter, bread on the soldier's table, metal against cup. Inside, the minimum becomes a rite, dividing the last crust as if it were a secret liturgy, counting breaths so as not to break, marking the wall with a fingernail to conclude that time is still happening. The empire does not invade, it administers. It reorganizes the oxygen. That is what it does. And memory learns to breathe less. In modern theory, we call it bureaucratic violence, the kind that leaves no visible blood, but calcifies gestures, normalizes humiliation, instructs witnesses to look without remembering. A palace does not need to shout to subdue. It is enough to write your name, the date, and an assigned function. And when the function enters, the vow exits. Those who have gone through purges in other times and latitudes know this. It does not matter if it is called devshirme, reduction, internment, re-education, tutelage. The grammar varies. The intention remains, to extract the fiber of an identity until it sounds useful. Even so, there is something the machine miscalculates, the irreducible remainder of the sacred. It is not about luminous miracles, not yet, but about that which resists accounting. Eleni does not seek the heroism of martyrdom. She seeks not to be translated. Naming oneself, that is the most dangerous act. That is why the empire offers the perfect barter. I leave you your habit if you silence your history. I allow your song if its lyrics change. They call it peace, and peace in the lexicon of power is the stillness of the archive. Listen again to the 8 seconds. The bell falls silent, the birds break off, the smoke thickens. Between that void and the slamming of the bolts, something is decided. To sing not to ask for salvation, but to name what must not be erased. They are not hymns of heaven, they are songs of inverted inventory. In the melody there are dates, places, names. Where the scribe adds up bodies, they add up histories. Where the seal wants to close, the voice opens a crack. Those cracks will be the corridors of this chronicle. Constantinople does not yet appear, but it already weighs heavy. It weighs in the form of the threat. Domes that transform echoes, mosaics that someone will plaster over, bells that will be trained silence. It weighs as an administrative destination, transfer, integration, service. It weighs like the promise that the entire city is a massive office of selective memory. And yet in the chapel, before the transfer, a counter-archive is born. Not on paper, but in flesh. Not with ink, but with voice. Not with signatures, but with gazes that do not lower. I warn you from the start, what you are about to hear is not a pious legend. It is an instruction manual on how obedience is manufactured and how it cracks. If you ever wondered why certain regimes love form so much, here is the answer. Because the form teaches how to forget in alphabetical order. And if you ever wondered why certain prayers sound like whispers and not like screams, here is another. Because the whisper passes through walls that the scream awakens. This story advances in persistent whispers. Eleni grips the crucifix. Blood will not be needed for it to hurt. Accounting will suffice. When they close the door, when the water drops, when the laughter of others filters through the cracks, each one will decide if her mouth learns the new lyrics or if she keeps the old ones in the cavity of her chest. The empire believes it can administer even desire. It does not know, yet, that there are desires that feed on hunger. In a few days, they will be taken downhill. In a few weeks, they will cross a sea that promises no shores. In a few months, their name will be a line on a page. But today, in these 8 seconds that have already extinguished, began what they will never be able to seal. The hill dawned gray. The smoke from the north blended with the fog, and the bells did not ring at dawn. Instead, the hollow sound of horse hooves echoed through the valley. Eleni knew the wait was over. That chapel, which had withstood sieges and plagues, would fall not by fire, but by decree. When the door opened, it was not war that entered, but the law. A parchment spread over the altar replaced the sword. Black ink, red seals, a language of subjugation disguised as mercy. The empire grants refuge and sustenance to those who embrace the true faith. But everyone knew what that phrase meant. The man who spoke it was a bureaucrat with the hands of a scribe. His uniform, impeccable. His voice modulated by the habit of commanding. He read without looking at the women. He saw them, but he did not observe them. To him, they were entries on a list, not souls. Behind him, the soldiers maintained the stillness of instruments. They did not raise weapons. Their presence was enough. Modern domination did not need to shout. It was enough to organize. When the reading ended, the silence weighed like a dead body. The interpreter stuttered as she translated, "Convert and serve, or disappear." In that instant, the air changed. The nuns did not cry, they did not pray. They simply breathed all at the same time, as if sharing a single lung. Then Eleni stood up. The dawn light drew a line across her face. "We have already been taken," she said. "There is nothing else you can possess." The officer did not reply. He smiled, the smile of someone who believes he has heard useless poetry. He gave an order. The doors were closed from the outside. No one screamed. There was no need. The most effective violence is the one that teaches the other to obey without understanding why. Days passed. The water was reduced to a bowl, the bread to crumbs. Prayers became whispers without an addressee. The women slept in shifts, so as not to confuse dreams with madness. Sometimes one would laugh for no reason. Others would stare at the wall, counting the cracks as if they were calendars. Through the slits crept laughter, the smell of roasted meat, clinking glasses. The soldiers outside celebrated what was slowly crumbling inside. The youngest, Magdalena, barely 17 years old, broke the silence one night. She laughed, but her laughter was a fracture. "He doesn't hear us," she murmured. "Not here." Theodora, the eldest, took her hand. "He does hear us, even if we cannot hear him." It was a minimal dialogue, but it was enough to keep them human. The empire knew it. Hunger breaks you, but hunger with a purpose creates saints. That is why they measured their punishment with precision. They were not looking for martyrs, but obedient subjects. They wanted to erase the flame, not light the bonfire. On the third dawn, when the sky burned red, the women began to sing, not hymns of salvation, but ancient songs from when Greek and Latin shared prayer. They were melodies without text, barely laments rising against the iron of silence. The officer outside grew restless. The sound was pure, almost clean. He had faced rebellions, not prayers. This was different, a denial that did not scream. Eleni intoned with a firm voice. The walls, like accomplices, returned the multiplied echo. That was their first victory, turning stone into a choir. When the singing ended, the convent was empty of fear. Faith, stripped of hope, had become resistance. No one asked for mercy. No one denied. Outside, the soldiers awaited orders. Inside, the women prepared their souls for the inevitable. What the empire did not understand was that you cannot administer memory without paying a price. That night, the door opened again. A different emissary entered, Hassan Pasha. His gait was calculated, almost ritualistic. He looked around, not with desire but with study. "You will march with me toward the sea," he said. "Your voices will now serve the empire." The phrase, spoken with serenity, hurt more than any whip. It was not a threat, it was destiny. They tied them 2 by 2, ropes damp from the morning dew. Eleni raised her head. Through the window, the dawn dyed the clouds purple. She knew she would never see it the same way again. Magdalena, passing by the altar, saw the twisted crucifix, one of its arms broken, the melted wax sliding down like a tear. She looked at it and whispered something no one heard. Perhaps a farewell, perhaps an oath. They left in silence. The wind carried the smell of scorched earth and metal. The villages in the distance were lifeless shadows, wells filled with stones, doors open to nothing. Their footsteps echoed on the dust, each one an affirmation that they still existed. When the sun went down, a soldier threw them a water skin. None of them drank. Fasting had become a language. Hunger, a prayer. In the distance, a dog barked at the smoke. Under the first star, Theodora began to hum a melody older than any border. One by one, the others followed her. Tied ropes, exhausted bodies, raised voices. The sound rose through the valley, brushed the olive trees, and faded into the air. In the soldiers' dreams that night, the voices returned, as if the earth itself remembered. Domination had been set in motion, but something in the invisible was beginning to resist, and no one, not even Hassan Pasha, could stop a song that had learned to survive the silence. The second day of the march began with a merciless sun. Shadows stretched across the road like omens. The ropes tightened around the women's wrists, and the parched earth returned their steps with a dust that clung to their veils like a penance. The hills, once green, were now open wounds. To one side, a field of withered olive trees offered them an image of what they were destined to be. Roots without water, leaves without a voice. The road snaked along the spine of the mountains, a route traced by generations of merchants and dead armies. Eleni walked at the front. She did not need anyone to dictate the pace. The others' steps synchronized with hers, as if in that cadence they found an echo of prayer. Behind, Theodora walked slowly, dragging her shadow, but with her head held high. An uncomfortable silence breathed among the soldiers. Authority feared stillness, but it feared even more what it could not understand. Noon arrived with the weight of iron. The air vibrated, the stones burned, and sweat mixed with the blood from their feet. Magdalena stumbled. A soldier caught her by the arm, not with compassion, but with the automatic gesture of duty. She murmured a prayer, barely a thread of a voice, and kept going. The prayer did not ask for salvation, but for endurance. That afternoon they reached a valley. There the olive trees grew in rows, standing upright like mourners. The commander ordered a halt. "Rest," he said, although everyone knew that rest was another form of punishment. The soldiers lit fires. The smell of freshly baked bread filled the air. One of them left a basket near the women. Warm, white loaves, a poison gift. No one moved. Eleni looked at the embers and spoke with a serene voice. "They offer what they will later claim. What feeds also binds." She turned her back to the basket. The others imitated her. Abstinence became an act of rebellion. Where the empire sought submission, they found a way to purify themselves. Night descended thick, without a moon. The song of the insects was the only thing that survived the heat. Theodora approached Magdalena, who was trembling with thirst. "When you cannot pray," she whispered, "listen." Magdalena closed her eyes. What she heard was not the murmur of the nearby stream, but something older, the pulse of the earth, the heartbeat of the world. She understood that faith needs no temple when the ground itself remembers. Before dawn, one of the soldiers woke with a start. He heard a low, constant sound like a vibration. He stepped out of his tent with his sword drawn. It came from the place where the captives slept. He approached, fearful, and saw it. The women sitting in the dust, all facing east, singing a wordless melody in a low voice. It was neither plea nor surrender. It was testimony, a song of those who do not expect to be heard, only remembered. The soldier sheathed his weapon. He did not understand, but he felt shame. For the first time since the march began, he looked away. On the fourth day, the horizon changed. The air smelled of salt. The proximity of the sea was both promise and condemnation. The sight of the water provoked a silence that neither hooves nor shouts broke. The sea shone with an inhuman blue, vast and alien, a border between the earthly and the eternal. Hassan Pasha, mounted on his horse, watched without emotion. Beside him, a soldier murmured, "Even the sea bows before the empire." But Pasha did not reply. He knew that the sea bows to no one. It only devours with patience. Upon arriving at the port, the bustle enveloped them. Merchants, animals, shouts, the smell of fish, tar, and bodies. The nuns, barefoot, moved through the crowd like ghosts. People looked at them, some with pity, others with fear. A child tried to touch Magdalena's veil, but his mother immediately pulled him away. The unspoken order was universal. Look, but do not remember. They were chained in a line in front of a ship. The wood of the hull was still marked by ancient battles. "Board," a soldier ordered. No one moved. It was Eleni who took the first step. She climbed slowly like someone ascending an altar. The others followed her. Below deck, the darkness welcomed them with a sour smell of iron and dampness. They were tied to the benches, wrist to wrist, ankle to wood. The light that entered through the cracks was golden and dirty, a parody of dawn. Magdalena rested her head on the plank and murmured, "Yeah, though I walk through the valley." Another voice replied, "I will fear no evil." The ship moved with a groan. The oars struck the water in unison. Every stroke was a heartbeat, human, mechanical, eternal. In the darkness, Theodora traced a cross on the wood with her fingernail. It was not a prayer, it was a record. Every mark, proof that they still existed. Outside, the waves sang with them, and for a moment, even the sea seemed to keep silent to listen. The storm arrived without warning. The sky, which had dawned burnished with mist, turned to lead. Thunder cracked over the galley as if the sky itself were reclaiming the echo of the chained voices. The sea roared. The ship creaked like a wounded animal. The sisters did not scream. They prayed louder. Drops seeped through the cracks, and the salt water mixed with their tears. With every battering of the waves, the hull seemed to bend without breaking, held together by something more than wooden nails, the stubbornness of their faith. The commanding officer tried to maintain order. He shouted instructions that the wind devoured. The oarsmen, exhausted, moved their arms like shadows. In the midst of the confusion, Eleni looked up toward the upper opening and saw lightning split the sky. In that flash, she thought she saw a face, not of a saint, but of a witness. "He remembers," she murmured, and the phrase, repeated by other mouths, became a prayer. When dawn returned, the sea was a mirror of iron. The waters calmed, but the ship smelled of fear and wet wood. A young nun, soaked and trembling, asked Eleni, "Is this hell?" She looked toward the horizon line, where a city was emerging from the fog. Domes, minarets, golden towers. "No," she replied. "Hell remembers you. This place will not." The galley advanced toward Constantinople, the jewel and the executioner of the ancient world. As they drew closer, the absent bells transformed into calls to prayer. The sound of the muezzin slithered through the air like a tame snake, filling the space where hymns once reigned. The sun beat down on the domes, turning them into mirrors of power. When the ship stopped at the port, the chains were removed with a screech that seemed to tear through centuries. The women went up on deck, blinded by the light. The port was seething with activity, merchants shouting, soldiers lined up, slaves unloading crates marked with the imperial seal. The mix of smells, sweat, incense, fish, and tar, was unbearable. Hassan Pasha waited on the dock, with his immaculate tunic and his weightless gaze. "Welcome to the heart of the world," he said. "The city of peace." His tone was a mockery without the need for sarcasm. The words slid over the women like a curse. Peace, thought Eleni, the emptiest word in the dictionary of empires. They were led through the market. People stepped aside, curious and fearful. A child crossed himself in secret. A woman, hidden behind her veil, murmured an ancient prayer, but no one dared to look twice. In the empire, compassion was a crime of memory. The group advanced until the shadows of the temple fell upon them. Hagia Sophia rose before their eyes, a mountain of gold and silence. It was once the house of their god. Now crowned by the crescent moon, it was the sanctuary of another. The mosaics of the angels were still there, but under layers of plaster and lime. The eyes of those figures, invisible, kept watching from behind the wall. Eleni looked up. She did not utter a word. She knew God would hear her all the same. The bell that once called to prayer was now dust, but its sound persisted in the memory of the air. Sometimes silence is a sustained note. The soldiers forced them to kneel when the call to prayer began. The voice spread like a river, filling the corridors, the streets, the skies. The women did not resist physically. They resisted in another way, by keeping their eyes open. Hassan Pasha watched them from an angle, intrigued. He did not see rebellion, but something worse, presence. Power fears the enemy less than the one who does not disappear. When the prayer ended, he ordered them to rise and follow him. They crossed a courtyard where the marble reflected the sun like a cruel mirror. They went down a damp staircase, each step descending further into the earth and oblivion. The air grew thick. The smell of old stone mixed with salt and rust. They reached a blackened oak door, sealed with a chain. Hassan Pasha made a gesture, and one of the guards opened the padlock. The sound of the metal echoed like a small thunderclap. On the other side, the darkness breathed. "Here you will serve," Pasha said, his voice soft, almost paternal. "Here you will learn peace." No one answered. When the door closed, the noise of the bolt was a final heartbeat. The silence that followed was louder than any plea. The women looked at each other without words. Eleni ran her fingers over the rough wall and felt a mark. It was not natural. It was an ancient engraving. A cross. Then another. And another. Hundreds. Someone had been there before. Perhaps centuries ago. Perhaps yesterday. In the gloom, Theodora whispered, "We are not the first, but we will not be the last." The phrase floated in the air like a promise. High above, the domes of the empire reflected the midday light. Below, in the bowels of the marble, a new chapter of oblivion was beginning to be written. But on the walls, beneath the layer of dust, there was already a gospel engraved with fingernails and hope. The history of those who resisted while being forgotten. For weeks, no one spoke their names. In the corridors of the palace, they were shadows shaped like women, silences scrubbing marble, and washing silk tunics soaked in perfumes they would never wear. The soldiers walked past them without looking. Power does not need whips when it possesses indifference as a weapon. Every dawn was the same. The door creaked, the chains clinked, a guard uttered a single word, "Work," and the world began again. Eleni learned to walk without making a sound. Theodora counted the steps between the corridors by the memory of the echo. Magdalena, the youngest, had lost track of the days. She marked the time by drawing a line with a piece of stone on the cell wall every time the candle in the hallway went out. The lines grew like roots. None of them knew if they represented days or prayers, but knowing no longer mattered. Eleni understood that the empire wanted to turn them into part of the building, like human columns, firm, silent, useful. But beneath that routine of servitude, a different order was beginning to form. Obedience, when performed without faith, transforms into a rite, and a rite can contain memory. At night, upon returning to the cell, the women gathered around the darkness. There was no fire, no lamp, no singing, only breaths. Then someone, perhaps Magdalena, began to hum. It was a low, almost imperceptible sound, a note that crawled along the stone. The others followed her. Every night the murmur grew. They did not need words. Every tone was a memory, a coded prayer. One early morning, the bolt on the door moved. They all froze. A piece of bread rolled from the threshold and stopped in front of them. Eleni picked it up carefully, broke it into pieces, and distributed it among them all. "We share what was not given to us," she said. That phrase became their new creed. Days later, a young guard left an extra jug of water. He did not do it out of pity, but out of fear. He had heard the singing in the tunnels. They said that at night the air moved on its own, that the walls murmured words that no language of the empire could translate. With winter, the cold seeped through the stones. The women's breath turned to smoke. The water froze in the pitchers before touching their lips. On the walls, the frost traced small crosses, reflecting the dim light of the torches. The nuns looked at them as if they were miracles drawn by the frost. One night, Theodora did not wake up. She died with her hands clasped, her face turned toward the wall she had covered with prayers. They buried her beneath the floor of the cell, with a spoon and their own fingernails. Eleni engraved a phrase in Latin on the slab. "Lux in tenebris lucet." The light shines in the darkness. From then on, something changed. The songs grew louder. The notes did not ask for liberation. They were hymns of permanence. The air somehow grew warmer. Even the guards began to notice it. One, upon opening the door, stepped back in fright. He swore that the air inside the cell was burning, as if an invisible fire had ignited the walls. That same night, a bowl of oil appeared, along with a fragment of parchment. It had a symbol engraved on it, a cross inside a crescent moon, and a phrase in Greek, "The world remembers those who refuse to disappear." Eleni read it aloud. The women lit a flame with that oil, the first light they had seen in months. The flame was weak, but its reflection made the engravings on the walls gleam like stars. Every line, every word shone as if it were new. Hassan Pasha dreamed of bells that night, not of the bronze of the churches he had silenced, but of an older sound, the echo of the soul remembering. He woke with a start. He thought he heard footsteps beneath the floor, the murmur of a prayer. He ordered security reinforced, but at dawn no guard wanted to go near the subterranean corridor. The rumors grew. There was talk of candles lighting themselves, of songs rising through the palace vents, of female shadows crossing the rooms. Some said it was the work of the devil, others that it was faith taking its revenge. Eleni knew the truth. It was neither revenge nor a miracle. It was memory, and memory, when it refuses to die, becomes sacred. One afternoon, as the sun sank over the Bosphorus, Hassan descended to the basement. He entered the cell with a torch. The women looked at him without fear. In the center of the floor, the flame in the bowl still burned, although no one had fed it. The air smelled of myrrh and something else, of purity, of defiance. "What have you done?" he asked. Eleni looked up. In her eyes there was no resentment, only certainty. "Nothing that your empire can record." Hassan stepped back. The torch trembled. On the walls, the light revealed hundreds of golden crosses, freshly engraved, still shining. The stone itself seemed to breathe. That night, the entire palace shuddered with a slight tremor. It was not an earthquake or the wind. It was the earth remembering. From then on, the soldiers refused to guard that corridor. They said that when night fell, the air sang. The flame never went out again. Winter crept through the palace foundations like a blind beast. The cold seeped through the cracks in the stone, turning every breath into a little ghost. The women huddled together, covering themselves with what they had once used to clean the sultan's floors. Their cracked fingers bled, but they no longer felt pain. They had transformed it into rhythm, into habit, into prayer. The routine continued mercilessly. Every dawn, the deadbolt. The guard, a different one each week, because no one could endure that shift for too long, would open the door without looking inside. Eleni led the group. They went down to the corridor, gathered the buckets, the cloths, the pitchers. The entire palace rested upon their silence. No one was supposed to hear them, not even living. "If they make no noise, they do not exist," the scribes used to say, and yet their non-existence became their way of enduring. They washed the floors of the halls where the sultan ate, where the concubines laughed, where the ministers plotted new orders. Sometimes, while scrubbing the marble, they heard the strumming of a lute or the laughter of the powerful. But the music, instead of humiliating them, reminded them that even beauty could be profaned. At night, they returned to the cell. The door closed, and the darkness welcomed them like a mother. The walls were no longer enemies. They breathed with them. Every crack had a name. Every carved line was a passage from a gospel that only they could read. Magdalena, the youngest, began to write with a shard of pottery. Not full words, but strokes, symbols, broken prayers. "In case someone comes," she said once, "so they know we were here." Eleni smiled. "No one will find these stones," she replied. "Then they will know that oblivion is not absolute." In the gloom, their faith became a science. They learned to measure time by the cadence of the guard's footsteps, by the dripping of water from the beams, by the trembling of mice moving through the straw. The liturgy was reduced to gestures, sharing crumbs, exchanging glances, touching the wall before sleeping. One day the air changed. It was no longer just dampness, it smelled of sickness. On the upper floors there was talk of fever, of delirious bodies murmuring names of saints no one had taught them. The doctors could find no cause. Hassan Pasha, growing paler each night, listened to the rumors with the calm of someone who understands too late. The servants spoke of voices. They said the underground tunnels were singing, that when the wind slipped through the vents, it brought melodies without a language, mere whispers, and that the newborn children in the harem cried upon hearing them. An imam swore he had heard a choir blending with the call to prayer, so faint it seemed like a harmony. No one dared to confirm it. One night the cell door opened again, not with violence, without a sound. A hooded man left something on the floor, an oil lamp and a piece of parchment. Then he left. He did not lock the deadbolt. The ensuing silence was so perfect it hurt. Eleni picked up the parchment. It was written in Greek. "The world remembers those who refuse to be buried." No one knew who sent it. A repentant guard, an infiltrated monk, an echo from the past. It didn't matter. It was proof that history was still breathing. They lit the lamp. Its golden light filled the cell, and the crosses on the walls gleamed as if inhabited by gold. The shadows danced and the women sang. Not for salvation, but for memory. They sang until the stone vibrated. Above, the palace shook. The soldiers woke up startled. They swore they heard bells. Eleni, with her eyes closed, murmured, "Now they hear us." In the morning, when the guards came down, they found the cell quiet. The women were on their knees, eyes open, hands on the still warm floor. In the center, the lamp was still burning, even though there was no oil left. Hassan Pasha entered. He stared at the fire without understanding. His face hardened. "Enough," he said. But the word had no effect. The flames did not go out. On the walls, the crosses seemed to shine with freshly carved gold dust. The soldiers backed away, crossing themselves, forgetting they were not Christians. Eleni spoke. "You cannot silence what never belonged to you." That night, in the old quarter, some claimed to see lights ascending from the palace floor, small flames rising as if the underground were exhaling stars. In the streets, dogs howled without cause. In the hidden monasteries, monks woke up suddenly, convinced they had heard a female choir coming from the sea. Hassan, unable to sleep, went out to the balcony. The wind from the Bosphorus carried the scent of myrrh and wax. On the horizon, Hagia Sophia shone under the moon. For a moment he thought he heard bells. Then everything returned to silence, but it was not silence. It was the breathing of that which cannot be killed. Spring never reached the palace hallways. On the surface, the gardens bloomed, but below, in the corridors where the air smelled of rust and contained faith, time remained at a standstill. The guards no longer entered. They only left the rations through a slit, avoiding looking inside. They said the shadows moved on their own, that when the door was opened, human warmth could be felt, even though there was no fire. No one wanted to guard what seemed to guard itself. The women continued their lives as if the empire had forgotten their existence, and perhaps it was true. They worked by night, slept by day, or at least pretended to. They had learned to read the silence of the place, the footsteps on the marble, the creaking of the beams, the murmur of water traveling beneath the floor. In those signs they found messages, as if the building itself were speaking to them. "The stone remembers," Eleni would say, and the others nodded. One afternoon the sky changed color. A dry clap of thunder was heard from the upper courtyard, but it did not rain. It was as if the city had held its breath. That night, when darkness covered Constantinople, the women gathered around the lamp that was never consumed. Eleni, with a serene voice, spoke words that were neither prayer nor sermon. "If they cannot kill us, they will try to forget us, so we will sing to prevent it." And they began to sing. Not in Greek or Latin, but in a language without grammar, made of notes, of breaths, of memory. The walls trembled, and the air, for the first time, seemed to expand. The guards on the upper levels woke up startled. Some claimed to have felt the earth move, others that the invisible bells of a buried church were ringing beneath their feet. Hassan Pasha emerged from his room, his face pale and distraught. He went down to the tunnels with a torch. The flame trembled violently, though there was no wind. When he reached the final corridor, he stopped in his tracks. In front of the cell, the door was ajar. Inside, the women stood, surrounded by a golden glow. In the center, the lamp burned calmly. There was no smoke, no smell of oil, only light. "What is this?" he murmured. No one answered. He took a step closer. Eleni raised her head. Her eyes looked like molten glass. "This is no miracle," she said. "It is memory ignited." Hassan stepped back. For a moment he thought the light was passing through him, that his shadow was being imprinted on the walls. "Put that out," he ordered. But his voice sounded hollow, devoid of authority. The women kept singing, and the air vibrated. The stone seemed to absorb the sound, to store it, as if the entire building were turning into an instrument. That night the servants spoke of a tremor. Some said the lamp in the main hall swayed without cause. Others that the water of the Bosphorus receded a few meters before advancing again, as if the city had exhaled. At dawn, Hassan returned. He expected to find bodies, but he found them calm, sitting in a circle, the lamp's light reduced to a thread. The air was warm. The crosses carved into the walls shone with golden reflections. Upon touching them, he discovered they were neither paint nor metal, but stone that seemed to have mutated. "What have you done?" he repeated. Eleni barely smiled. "We have prayed with time." The soldiers entered in fear. One of them, brushing against one of the crosses, was burned. He swore the wall was breathing. Hassan said not a word. He left without looking back. That very afternoon, he ordered the corridor sealed. No one enters. No one goes down. Let silence be the law once again. But the order came too late. That night, the entire city felt a vibration. It was not an earthquake, nor wind, nor war. Clocks stopped. Birds fell silent. From the palace floor rose a faint music, barely perceptible, as if an invisible church were ringing its bells again after centuries. Muslim clerics in the mosques looked at each other, unable to continue their prayers. In the Christian quarters, monks woke up weeping. No one understood anything, but everyone felt the same thing, a presence not of ghosts, but of something that refused to disappear. In the cell, the women were at peace. Eleni had left the lamp in the center. The fire no longer belongs to us, she said. It belongs to whoever remembers. In the morning, when the guards came down with pickaxes and cement to seal the entrance, the cell was empty. There were no bodies, no clothes, no chains, only the hot air and, on the back wall, a newly carved phrase in Latin, Memorialia Manent. Memory remains. One of the men fell to his knees. Another fled screaming. Hassan watched in silence. He understood that there was no possible victory against something that could not be recorded. He ordered the door bricked up and plastered over. The workers labored until dawn, but as they laid the last stone, they heard voices on the other side, a low, unbreakable choir, repeating the same melody that had been born that night. The master mason trembled. "They are still there." "No," Hassan replied without looking at him. "They are everywhere now." Above, the dawn bathed the dome of Hagia Sophia. In the distance, the first call to prayer of the day echoed over the city. And in the deepest echo, imperceptible to human ears, a harmony answered from underground, the song of those who could not be erased. The silence that followed the disappearance was more deafening than any scream. Days went by without orders, without reports, without explanations. Hassan Pasha stopped sleeping. His sleep was a mosaic of female shadows walking in circles beneath the stone. In the upper hallways, the servants spoke in whispers. They said that at nightfall, footsteps could be heard, the rustle of veils, a murmur that came from nowhere and yet echoed everywhere. The corridor where the cell had been sealed became a taboo. No one named it. No one crossed it. However, the air in that area was always warmer, and sometimes it smelled of wax and myrrh. The guards who passed nearby claimed that the floor vibrated beneath their feet as if someone were walking very slowly in the depths. One swore he had felt a hand rest on his shoulder. When he turned around, no one was there. The news did not reach the imperial records. The bureaucracy of power has its own way of erasing miracles. It calls them structural anomalies, routine maintenance, sealed works. But legends are the counter-report of the people. The rumors grew, crossing walls and generations. In the palace kitchens, the servants repeated the same phrase. Not to remember them is to offend them. At night, Constantinople slept, but the wind coming up from the Bosphorus carried more than salt. Some said a choir could be heard underwater, like a metallic echo. Others that the invisible bells of destroyed churches rang when no one was ringing them. A blind old man from the Christian quarter claimed he could feel the ground tremble to the rhythm of a prayer. "It is their heart," he would say. "It keeps beating beneath the city." In the palace, Hassan became a specter. He avoided mirrors, for he said he saw reflections in them that did not belong to him. Sometimes he would go down alone to the bricked-up staircase with a lamp in his hand and stand there for hours, motionless, listening. The guards would find him at dawn, his face pale and his lips moving silently, as if trying to remember a melody he could not forget. One night, unable to bear the stillness, he ordered the wall opened again. The masons trembled. When they removed the last brick, the air that came out was warm and smelled of incense. Inside, there were no bodies or bones, only a layer of glowing dust, like golden ash. On the wall, new words in Latin, carved with impossible precision. Nos non sumus umbrae. We are not shadows. Hassan stepped back. The lamp trembled in his hand. The silence inside the enclosure was absolute, but his heart beat with a force he did not remember ever feeling. "What do you want from me?" he murmured. A draft of air blew out the flame. In the darkness, a voice, soft, choral, multiple, answered, "Remember." The passage was sealed again at dawn, this time with cast iron. No one ever touched it again. But the palace changed. The water clocks broke down. The scribes began to find strange phrases written on their parchments, in dead languages. Sometimes on new moon nights, the windows of the east wing would fog up with the shapes of hands, as if someone from the inside were trying to get out. Years passed. Sultans grew old. Titles changed. Wars came and went. But beneath the stone, the voices continued. The sailors who docked at the port said the city's ground vibrated with a constant rhythm, like a pulse. "It is the empire breathing," the soldiers would reply. But the old men in the market knew the truth. It was not the empire, it was memory refusing to die. A century later, when British restorers explored the foundations of the old Topkapi, they found a petrified, intact lamp beneath a slab. On the rim, almost erased by time, 3 words in Latin could still be read: Memorialia Custodis Anima. Memory guards the soul. The official report classified it as a devotional object of no historical value. But one of the archaeologists, a young man with an uncertain gaze, wrote a note in the margin. "When lighting a candle nearby, the air grows warm. I feel something awakening." That note was never published. Since then, every so often, when the city trembles slightly or the wind blows from the south, some swear they hear a song rising from the bowels of the earth. It has no words, only a melody that seems to come from the very heart of Constantinople. And those who hear it for an instant understand what Hassan could never accept: that faith, when turned into memory, no longer belongs to heaven or to the empire. It belongs to time. Time, which erases everything, has chosen not to erase this. Centuries passed, and the city changed its name so many times that maps began to forget it. Constantinople became Istanbul, but the echo of the bells that no longer existed kept breathing beneath the foundations. The empire fell, flags changed, palaces were transformed into museums, but something, a faint pulsation, remained alive in the stone. In 1915, a group of European archaeologists arrived at the old Topkapi. They were excavating in search of Byzantine tunnels. Among them was a young Italian architect named Lorenzo Marini, obsessed with places where history seemed to sleep. It was he who noticed that one of the underground passageways ended abruptly in a more recent plaster wall. The wall seemed to breathe. Leaning against it, he felt a slight warmth, impossible in the middle of winter. He asked for permission to open it. The Turkish officials refused, but scientific curiosity is a form of faith. One night, without authorization, Marini and 2 workers removed the first layer of plaster. Behind it was blackened stone. On it, an almost erased inscription: Memorialia Manent. Memory remains. The air that came out was dense, aromatic, laden with glowing dust. Illuminating the interior with a flashlight, Marini saw the walls covered in engravings: crosses, circles, words in Latin, Greek, and something he did not recognize. In the center, on a slab, an ancient lamp petrified in place. He touched it. It was warm. The workers fled, convinced they had disturbed a sacred tomb. Marini was left alone. In silence, he noted in his journal, "I feel that this place remembers. I don't know who." When the team returned the next day, the wall was sealed again. No one could explain how. Official documents did not mention the discovery, but Marini's logbook survived. Decades later, a Greek historian found it in a library in Rome. On one of the last pages, the architect had written, "I heard a song, very low, as if the stone were breathing. They were not sad voices. They sounded as if someone had forgiven me." Throughout the 20th century, the city continued to change. The palace became a museum. Electric lamps replaced candles. Tourists walked the halls without knowing that beneath their feet lay a chapel of memory, sealed with ancient fire. From time to time, a guide would mention a legend. They say a light appeared here on a night without electricity, and no one could explain it. Everyone laughed, but the night shift guards avoided that sector. In 1987, a mild earthquake shook Istanbul. No buildings collapsed, but a crack opened in the vault of a forgotten tunnel. The engineers sent to inspect it found golden dust in the crevices. They took it to be analyzed. The laboratory report indicated unknown particles, organic and metallic composition, reacts to human heat. The document was archived and never disclosed. Today, the corridor remains closed. Visitors walk over it without knowing. Sometimes, when the wind from the Bosphorus enters through the windows, a draft of warm air rises from the floor. Some tourists claim to hear a distant song, almost imperceptible, as if the walls were sighing. Guides attribute it to the building's acoustics, but those who have worked there too long know there are things that cannot be explained, only respected. An elderly guard who has watched over the museum for 30 years says that every time he prays, an invisible flame flickers in front of him. They are still here, he murmurs. They do not ask for justice, only not to be forgotten. Perhaps that is all that remains of the miracle, a quiet persistence, a resistance against the archive, against chronology, against institutional oblivion. Not a revenge, but a permanence. In the basements where no one enters, the air retains the temperature of human breath. And on the stone, beneath layers of lime, one can still read, barely in the right light, Nos non sumus umbrae, vivat in memoria. We are not shadows. We live in memory. Time has passed, but the song continues. Some hear it at dusk, others in dreams. No one can reproduce it because it has no notes or words. It is the voice of what was and refused to be extinguished. And as long as there is someone who remembers, an archaeologist, a guard, a reader, the lamp will remain lit, not in marble, nor in history, but in the very act of remembering. Memory in the end has defeated the empire,